All right. Well, we're in the topic of irrigation tonight, and like any of the Great Lakes Turf School topics, we're packing a lot of information into just a couple hours, and the goal with the readings is to give you enough resources to further educate yourself on the topic we have here. The irrigation topic for me is one that I'm really passionate about. Spent 6 years at the U of M Extension, basically trying to get people to stop watering their lawns every other day type of thing. So, we'll get into where my thoughts are with that. And Dr. Soldat will give some of his perspective as well as we go along the slides here. So, but I think we can all understand and appreciate, just the precious resource that water is, and why as turfgrass managers, we need to be responsible in managing that appropriately. Okay, so with that, we're going to just go ahead and get started here. So the basic overview of what we'll cover tonight, just a background on irrigation. So this is the Great Lakes School of Turfgrass Science. So, we're more geared towards, why water is important and the right amounts of water, and those, what plants need water for, rather than we're not going to get much into irrigation install or irrigation design here at all tonight. That's a lot that you would learn through on-the-job training or through certifications with the Irrigation Association, for example. So we're going to talk just briefly. I know Doug touched on this, but the dynamics of soil moisture and really kind of what's happening there. We'll talk about the art and science of irrigation, and why managing water effectively, in our hands, it causes a lot of us to kind of scratch our heads, because, scientifically, our recommendations, we have a hard time practically applying them to a real world. So we would all talk about just the fact of irrigating as an art form, even today, more so than really a science. We'll talk about irrigation scheduling. We'll talk briefly about irrigation systems and a little bit about how you would go about auditing an irrigation system, very basic procedure there. And then we're going to wrap up the topic tonight with water conservation. We'll talk about the 10 core water conservation strategies. We'll talk a little bit about the grasses that might give you a much better leg up as far as water use is concerned. So starting here with just kind of the basic background in irrigation. Now, these are a few headlines from my area, but it really doesn't matter what community you live in. In the U.S. or even more internationally, water becomes more of a problem, internationally in certain areas as well. But just from our local newspaper here, big water bills create waves in Rockford, Minnesota. This is one from 2014, I believe. Woodbury issues a plea to limit watering, one of the more kind of upscale suburban areas in Minnesota here. And then New Brighton steps up summer water restrictions due to limited aquifer supply. Right? And the finger is always being pointed here at lawn watering. And I think if you have driven around the block or driven to work, after an inch or a couple inches of rain in your environment and seen lawn irrigation running, I think certainly the anti-lawn folks, they do have a leg to stand on, because we all see it, right? So here's just kind of my example. This is from the summer of 2014 here in Minnesota. This was my previous Twitter account. So over in Wayzata here, Lake Minnetonka was flooded due to 4 inches of rain on a Thursday. I never drive on this road here, but the reason I was driving on this road is because the road I would normally drive on was flooded and there were barricades on it. And 4 p.m, the homeowner's irrigation system is going off here. So my comment is, no amount of education can fix lazy. It certainly makes guys like Doug and I sad to see this, because it just gives the anti-lawn folks more ammo. And it was a detour on a flooded road here. The good news for all you folks here tonight is, the practicality of being able to set it and forget it, because we can't get to our homeowners' properties that we're managing on a daily basis, or our parks on a daily basis, whatever it may be. The irrigation industry, the manufacturers, have really come to the table with some of the technologies that are out there and available. So you can effectively set up an irrigation system on an odd, even watering program nowadays with the right sensor and feel very comfortable that this picture here is not going to be you, right? And you're not going to be one of those folks that's but just diving a little further into that Woodbury article specifically here. So it says Woodbury residents and businesses are probably overwatering their lawns. The city pumped 9.3 million gallons of water to its customers on Saturday, more than twice as much as it pumped on a typical winter day. It rained about 2 inches that day. Officials suspect automatic irrigation systems are to blame. I think they're probably pretty accurate with that based on the amount of work I've done in Woodbury and knowing what I know about that area. So it's unfortunate that, the cities and their infrastructure, they have to drill wells to supply that much more water just for these very, very peak times, of water use. My example is Woodbury uses like 2 or 3 wells to supply all their residents with water in the winter. They use like 20 wells in the summer months. And it's because of these automatic irrigation systems. I'm not much of a fan of rain sensors either, but we'll get into that. I think there's a lot of value with some of these smart controllers and some of these soil moisture sensors. And certainly as I go along here, Doug is going to have something that I say that he disagrees with. So Doug, just jump in at any point in time here. But just to put a little bit of scope on this, water for irrigation is certainly becoming increasingly limited no matter where you are, and a lot of people are having to make the choice, in like the California area of the US, for example, of whether to use their water resources for agriculture or lawns. And I think we can all agree that we'd probably feed ourselves first, than use water for grasses, which we really don't eat. It's more of an erosion control and an aesthetic type of thing. But I think there are kind of 4 key things that we need to think about as turf managers in trying to help solve this problem. The first one is becoming more efficient with irrigation. Certainly, there are a lot of tools out there nowadays that can help us with that. The second one is utilize strategies to reduce irrigation. So Doug would tell you improving soil, right? We see a lot of soils that are built on a lot of lawns that are built on soils with just not enough organic matter, for example, right? So building things right from the start, or even looking at some of that research and the value of composting on the surface of poor quality soils, even right on your turf at lower rates, can really help to reduce water use over time. Species comes into play here, soil aeration as well. I'm not much of an advocate for removing turf, but certainly that has a place in this whole debate also. And then consider alternative water sources. This is just going to continue to be a topic we discuss. Practically a lot of golf course folks now are looking at alternatives and are using recycled water. The infrastructure for homes and things like that just isn't there yet, but we'll have to go there at some point. And then lower expectations also, I think, comes into play here. Who cares if there's a brown dry spot on your Kentucky bluegrass lawn in the middle of the summer, right? Usually it rains, at least once a week, and you get some recovery in some short period of time. So that might be something you start thinking about as well. So now kind of more, scientifically, before we dive into some of these practical aspects here, to plants, water is, critical, right? So it's a vital constituent of all of our plant cells, very, very important there. This is from what, us in academia would kind of consider the Bible, of turfgrass management, very relevant today here, even from 1973 from Dr. Beard. But it's required for photosynthesis. If we remember back to, that part of the lecture there, carbon dioxide, water, and sunlight, and we get some carbohydrates. It's also the byproduct of respiration. It's a very, very good transport medium for nutrients, some compounds and gases. So, when we apply nitrogen to our turf system, that nitrogen becomes soluble in the water in our root zone. And as the grass takes up that water, it's also taking up that soluble nitrogen with it. And that's the way we're feeding plants. And Doug actually has some really neat research that shows the potential for uptake of nitrogen reduces greatly in the fall of the year, because our transpiration rates decrease. So as plants' growth start to slow down and take in less water, we get less uptake of nitrogen as well, which consequently can be a fairly vulnerable time to fertilize, if that makes sense to everybody. So there's some neat research going on there. And then also an influence of temperature change here. Just like our skin, as water evaporates from our skin surface, that's a cooling process, and the same thing happens with plants. Okay. Plant tissue is, roughly 80% water. We need a constant supply in the soil to maintain high quality turf. Too little, too much can certainly reduce vigor or health. So here, sort of physiologically, these are, four really important things. If we're not putting enough water down, our transpiration and the movement of water through our turfgrass system is going to shut down. Our photosynthesis stops. Our canopy temperatures can certainly rise because we don't have that evaporative cooling. And then our nutrient uptake would stop as well. If we have too much water, our root zone can be waterlogged, displacing oxygen in that root zone. So our respiration process can suffer because of that. We have soils that are more susceptible to compaction with too much water in them. Microbial activity is reduced, right, just because that lack of oxygen as well. And then some of the other issues here that you can see, the denitrification and the leaching of nutrients, and then susceptibility to diseases and insects and other weeds. Now, I'll say in general, for those homeowners or those higher level turf settings, sports fields, those with automated irrigation systems, and Doug, if you're paying attention, I'm going to ask you to chime in here. I see more of an issue for those with irrigation systems, more of an issue to turf due to overwatering than I do see to underwatering. But would you agree with that, Doug?
Yeah, that's actually one thing we do. I teach a class on turfgrass irrigation here, and one of the exercises is to write all the bad things associated with over irrigation, and then write all the bad things associated with lack of irrigation. And the list is just so much longer for overwatering. So try it yourself. I mean, it's really the only thing lack of watering is it turns brown. But everything else, diseases, insects, soil compaction, lack of heat stress tolerance, all that stuff is all because of too much water. And just think about it. Like we talked about in the soil section, drainage. So if you're over irrigating, you're kind of putting the plant in a situation it doesn't want to be in with too much water around.
Yeah, well, that's great stuff. I would certainly agree. I think we can be our own worst enemy in some cases, from that watering standpoint, certainly. So great. Okay, so moving on here. So quite simply, water absorption by turf grasses is governed by the extent of our rooting, right? So if we're looking to be water conscious or just looking generally to have better health of turf lawns, then anything we can do to promote root growth is going to benefit us from a water standpoint, right? Because the depth of our root system, you can really think of it as that reservoir that your grasses have to withdraw water from. If your reservoir is only a 2-inch depth, then we're going to get into a situation where we need to irrigate on an every other day type of program. If our reservoir is 6, 8, even we've seen on, sand-based sports fields, Kentucky bluegrass roots down to 12 inches. Well, people that achieve that level of root growth certainly don't have to apply water, at least from a frequency standpoint. They might be looking at more volume because just the sheer health of the plant is that much greater. So it's growing better and demanding more water, but the frequency can be greatly reduced. So anyway, think of all these factors in sort of this holistic approach and how you're, trying to manage to get to a certain goal. Everything comes into play here, right? Light, temperature, some of these environmental things that you can influence. Soil characteristics are a big one, and where most people kind of miss the boat. And then your cultural program here as well. So just about everything. So I brought up this topic, here just previously, but water is lost through plants from two main forces. One of the forces is called evaporation. We're all familiar with evaporation, right? And that's just water drying from a surface. Then there's this process called transpiration. Okay, the function is plant cooling. due to that evaporation process and then translocation of our nutrients and other materials as well. When you combine those two factors, evaporation and transpiration, we get this fancy term called evapotranspiration. It's not just a fun term to talk about. I think it's a really good guideline, at least to give us an indication of sort of, what is the drying power of the air at certain times of year or under certain weather conditions. The drawback of transpiration is certainly water loss as well, but that's, just one of those consequences that comes into play with the whole growing plants type of things here. Okay, so we've got H2O taken up by the root system with some nutrients and other compounds in there, and then we get water loss through the stomata of plants. If this is the first time you've heard the term stomata, these are kind of the pores that are present, millions of them, or I'm not sure, millions, I guess, but at least thousands of them on plant, each plant surface and plant leaves. So the stomata serve two main purposes. One is to release water through them. The other one is to take in carbon dioxide for photosynthesis. Okay. So these, what we're looking at on the outside, if everyone can hopefully see my cursor there, what we're looking at on the outside of these stomata are these things we call the guard cells. And that's what we're trying to show with these balloons here. So the water in the guard cells and some different ions can regulate kind of the opening and closing of these. But when they're open, we're prone to water loss and we get good CO2 uptake. When they're closed, we are conserving water and not losing water, but we're reducing the potential for that plant to be able to photosynthesize. Okay, so if we're on a really, really hot day and our stomata closed to try to save water, well, the consequence is a reduction in photosynthesis there as well. Just reiterating the point and the importance of water on a constant supply in our soils. The opening of the stomata is driven by moisture and turgor pressure, and there are some potassium ions, for example, that come into play there. Light also triggers the opening for stomata, and they're taking in CO2 mostly during the day there. And then the closing is driven by drought and darkness. This is just an example of St. Augustine grass, which would be a warm season grass, but really good close-up pictures to show that. We have 1 day, so well-watered site here, and then 8 days into that dry down, and you can see those stomata. Okay, so combining those two processes we talked about, we've got transpiration and evaporation. You get this process called ET or evapotranspiration, and we can create models to determine how much water our grass is going to lose on a daily basis. And the technology out there is such that they'll calculate that even for you, or you can tap into a local weather station and try to determine how much water you're going to lose. How much water you lose on a daily basis gives you a good indication of the amount that you need to replace, that next day to replenish the soil. Here, a few factors that come into play here. Solar radiation, probably the #1 driving force, I think. Doug talks about that certainly as well, in influencing the amount of water we're going to lose. So the height of, the sun angles, the day length duration here, humidity comes into play. So the more humidity we have in the air, the less water we're going to lose from our stand. Temperature, the hotter it is, the more water we lose. The more wind speed we have, the more water we're going to lose. And then the grass species have different water use rates also. So you'll see different recommendations of how much water to replace with these ET models based on the type of grass species that you have. And we'll talk about that. So why is this ET important? Really, it answers some of these fundamental questions, right? It gives us a quantifiable reference in helping us as turfgrass managers try to decide, these main questions: volume, how much water do we need to replace, and how often does that need to be replaced? Reasons for irrigating. So if we're replenishing soil moisture from an ET basis, then, our sole reason is kind of #1 there, right? Supplement that adequate moisture. And I think this is one of Dr. Foldat's slides here, but up for the manager to define what is adequate, right? So this is where that whole art comes into play here. What level of turf quality are your clients looking for? Are your players looking for there? What amount of browning are they willing to accept as well? But ultimately, if you withhold water and push your plants to a point of drought stress, long term, your plants are going to be better off for that. I usually say those that overwater from a frequency standpoint, unfortunately, have to continue overwatering because the root system is very, very shallow. So we call this deep and infrequent, and we'll get into that as we go along here. But we also use water for a lot of different things here, to water in fertilizers, our pesticides, in some cases our top dressing sands. We might be trying to cool our grass with water. We might have, poor water quality, or we might be influenced by salt water in some cases, and we might want to leach water through our system with salts, certainly to promote germination, and then do our frost removal also. Just a few other good reasons for irrigating. But mainly, I'm going to show a graph here on the next slide. The main point of why we irrigate, it's not meant to be the sole water source for your lawn. I think of the Twin Cities here as, we get 34, 35 inches of annual rainfall in the Twin Cities. If you added up all of the values for ET through the course of 9 growing months, that volume specifically would be more than sufficient to supply enough water. The problem is rainfall and soil storage is not synchronized with the plant needs related to time or quantity, meaning we get 2 inches of rain on a Tuesday and we might get nothing for 2 weeks. Well, after 5 or 6 days, your plants, all of that 2 inches never made it into our soil, first of all. Depending on our infiltration rate, we might have had only 5 inches in our soil, or excuse me, a half of an inch in our soil. So we lost 1.5 inches. But at some point, going forward, that rainfall that comes 2 weeks later will not be enough. So we're looking for irrigation as a supplement to natural rainfall here. So here's just a good graph. This is from Dr. Van Klein when he was the agronomist with the Toro Company. And this is my area here in Minneapolis, St. Paul. And you could do this model for Madison, where Doug is at, or for where any of you folks are at. So we've got precipitation with, the blue bar here. Okay, so we can see our precipitation values. In April, we might get 2 inches of rain. You get to May, for the month of May, we might get 3 inches. Usually the old cliche is to say your lawn needs 1 inch of moisture per week to survive. Well, if you look at these numbers, right, June, July, and August here in Minnesota, we get 4 inches in June. That's 1 inch per week. We get 3.5 in July and 3.5 in August, right? That's 1 inch per week, right? So that inch per week is just a really bad generalization. But it's meant to give you kind of some type of guidelines. Our ET rates are potential water loss from our turfgrass systems in the middle of the summer in Minnesota might be approaching that 6 inch mark. Okay, so this is kind of that time, this brown area here is really when we have this potential deficit and the need for irrigation. But most certainly it isn't an every other day thing. It's meant to piggyback off of the rainfall that Mother Nature gives you. And that's why some of this technology is really, really important, because we quite frankly can't get there often enough to manipulate our clients' irrigation systems based on what the weather is doing, right? Or you could sit on your couch and you could get one of these smart controllers now, like the Rockio system. There are a lot of different other options, and you can just shut your customer's irrigation system off right from your phone, and you can manage a lot of properties that way too. So there's an option there. Now, real big generalization here, but most of our folks in the class are from the U.S. here. So if we take a map of the U.S. and we look at the potential for water loss, that ET versus the level of rainfall we get, the precipitation rate, generally you'll see as we get further west, the drying power of the air and just the really low humidity in these areas, for example, and just the lower annual rainfalls. We need to irrigate more in the west than we do in sort of the eastern United States. A lot more humidity. I'm thinking kind of northeast, the New York area there, and pretty good rainfall amounts there. So this is kind of a really bad dividing line, but it helps to make my point here that depending on where you are nationally, your irrigation requirement is going to vary greatly. Now, just to bring in the warm season grass topic here, just very briefly, generally speaking, warm season grasses are much, much more efficient at utilizing water than cool season grasses are. And there are a lot of different reasons for that. Deeper root systems come into play, for example, the fact that they grow much better in the heat of the summer when, our cool season grasses are going through the process of photorespiration, which, maybe a little bit more of a topic than this class really needs, but that's one of the main reasons that our cool season grasses decline in the summer months is just that waste process called photorespiration. I can post an article up there on that. So if you see a quiz question related to this topic here, it might be a true and false question. For example, warm season grasses are much, much better than cool season grasses as far as general water use rates, but we do get a lot of variance between the species and the varieties that we choose. So now when we use these ET models and we have the controllers or we're going to weather stations, that's giving you sort of, what we would call an estimated ET. And any type of farmer, agronomist, lawn care manager would be using that same model to determine water loss, because again, it's just really telling you kind of the drying power of the air, right? All these different factors, the radiation, the wind speed. But keep in mind that it's not the same as actual ET or actual water loss. So to determine actual water loss, we would be taking that our crop coefficient, which is kind of this K value here, multiplied by our estimated ET. And I'll show you what that looks like on this next slide here. Okay. So main point here is just because your model tells you lost 1/10 of an inch that day, depending on what grass species you have, you might want to have a multiplier there with it. So here's just some kind of guidelines for, warm season versus cool season turf. And again, back to that same point that warm season turfs generally are much more efficient. So these values are kind of on a percentage basis. So you can think of this 0.2 as a 20%. You can think of this 1 as 100%. So for proper irrigation of warm season turf, we would take that ET value that we get from our model. And, this graph is saying we can apply 60% of that ET value. So if we lost 0.1 inches that day, multiply it by 60%, we need to replace, 0.06 basically. So 6/100ths of an inch if we have warm season turf, or, in that 60% to 80% range. If we're in cool season turf, you might have almost 100% straight multiplier, depending on what species you've chosen. The graph here is showing us, operating anywhere from that 80% to 95% range might be appropriate. So take that 0.1 value and multiply it by 90%, and you should get 0.9. Okay, so that's how we use those values there. Now, just very generally speaking, you're going to find that bluegrass would be on the higher end of the crop coefficient spectrum here than you would see for some of the fine fescue species, which are generally much better prepared for drought situations because they're low water users. Now, Doug and a good friend of mine, Dr. Michael Woods over in Asian Turfgrass Center over in Bangkok, Thailand, made this shiny app for everybody. So I posted this link on the web pages as well for in the supplemental readings. So this is meant to be just a calculator to give you some general guidelines of, kind of the drying power of the air, depending on where you are, northern, southern hemisphere, for example, what your maximum temperature range, and he has a crop coefficient input range here as well. I will tell you this is a general guideline. It's not going to get you to narrow down specifically because, there are a lot of different factors that come into play here. But finding some of these ET models can be quite challenging. Now, Doug, I'm just going to ask, have you seen this, and do you have any hesitations on using this real? We're only having a couple factors here, right? Where you are, we don't have a humidity factor here. We do have the solar radiation factor with this thing, but if we have a cloudy day, that might not be great. Our temperature is a good one here, but I know the University of Wisconsin specifically used to have a great system where you could punch in your zip code, and it even went to Minnesota, and you could find ET values more locally, but that doesn't exist anymore.
Yeah, that's gone. Again, crop coefficients are just really rough. They change on a a weekly basis. So if you have to pick one for the year, this is probably a pretty good way to do it. In a lot of systems, like you said, if you're doing residential installs all over, you can. But I mean, golf course superintendents, people, sports turf managers that are more actively managing their turf will do something we just call percent adjusting, which is like you're changing your crop coefficient almost on a, you know, kind of a landscape basis. So the front area, front lawn, it's sunny, you might have a crop coefficient of 0.9 or 1, which means it's going to get relatively more water than the back shady area, which you might set to 0.6 or 0.4 because it's the water loss factors are lower. So I'd say I'm always, it's good to know about the concept of it and what it means, but I'd be hesitant to say that there's one number that's going to fit everybody.
You bet. Awesome. Okay. Well, thanks, Doug. That really kind of sets the stage here for, you know, the rest of the session tonight. So getting into soil moisture dynamics, which I think is always really important to talk about, you know, when we talk about irrigation, because I think this is where a lot of us really miss the boat. And unfortunately, you know, if we're lawn care operators, we're generally not in the contractor business. So it might be a different person that installed the lawn for you, for example. So a lot of times we inherit just somebody else's bad work, right? Really compacted subsoils with bluegrass sod road all over top of them, you know, and the contractor, the cheapest bidding contractor that, you know, walks away and says, good luck to you, you know, and they really haven't done you many favors. But if they would have spent a little bit more money and a little bit more time just prepping that soil, you know, I think back to that picture that Doug sold of the soil that he has, you know, when he bought his house, you know, that contractor certainly didn't do him any favors, but, you know, he knew long term if he'll spend a little bit extra money on the forefront and remediating that soil, that, you know, his efforts in trying to maintain a decent lawn would not have to be as extensive. But I think this is a really good diagram kind of showing, you know, just basically what water's happening in, you know, a lot of our different turf systems. So in the really simplest sense, when water falls onto lawns or onto our sports turf, there are two, what I'll call immediate fates. And the immediate fates are either runoff, if we have sloped sites, or if we have very poor infiltrating heavy soils, then the runoff potential is very, very great. The second immediate fate is going to be infiltration, right? So, you know, the characteristics at the surface of where that irrigation or where that rainfall is falling, the characteristics right on that surface really sort of determine which one of those immediate fates is going to happen. And certainly oftentimes we have both of those fates happening, right? Runoff and some infiltration. Okay, so we're dealing with that. But then once water kind of sits there for a longer term, or you know, it'll infiltrate better into the soil, and we can get good root uptake with that. If we have really sandy soils, particularly, we can get deep percolation here. Sometimes we call that leaching, and that would go back to recharge the groundwater table. The good news environmentally with turf systems are, you know, if we have a soil that really good infiltration and a good root system in turf, you know, we're finding that turf can really do a good job of cleaning that water up before it gets to the groundwater table. So I know some researchers in Nevada, for example, that are looking at, you know, turf root systems as a filtration for a lot of these pharmaceuticals in recycled water, right? If we take Tylenol or we take Advil, you know, and then we pee that out, for lack of a better term, those products are still in our pee, right? So we need to figure out something to remove them, and turf can be pretty good for that. Evaporation can certainly happen. We talked about transpiration as well, but this is a really good diagram just to talk about the fate of water applied to a turf grass root system. And then Dr. Soldat talked about all these different things here, but you know, these soil characteristics are really what influence the infiltration rate and the fate of water immediately on that turf surface, right? So our soil texture, our soil structure that we talked about, the pore space and size in our soil, the soil moisture status has a bearing here as well. And we're going to get into this. So, you know, 3 kind of main soil moisture status that we think about as turf managers. Saturation, that's when all of the pore spaces in our soil are filled with water. We've got field capacity. That's basically what your soil will hold after gravity has done its thing. And that's kind of where we like to operate. That's the comfortable, safe zone, operating with our soils and field capacity. And that means that some of our pore spaces in the soil do have adequate oxygen. Permanent wilting point would be the point you get to where if past that, you don't replenish the water, you're looking at some potentially long-term consequences and potential resodding or reseeding and actually losing some turf if we go past permanent wilting point. Compaction topography also come into play here. Here's just a really good diagram from one of Dr. Turgeon's textbook, Turf Grass Management, kind of a standard textbook for most introductory turf classes, just to sort of talk about, influence of our infiltration rate and the precipitation rate here, right? So if we've got a sloped surface here, and our infiltration rate is really, really good infiltrating soil, if it exceeds the rate that precipitation falls, we can even have very good uniform wetting on even a slope type of surface. So for example, if the infiltration rate of our soil is 1 inch per hour is the amount of moisture it will move, and the rainfall we get is a 1/2 inch in that hour, then even on a slope surface, we can have fairly uniform wetting. That's this dark area here of our soil moisture. Now, if our precipitation rate exceeds the infiltration rate or the rate at which soil is able to take in that water, that's when we get non-uniform wetting of our soil surfaces, especially on slopes. This is when we have really severe runoff potential here. So if our soil is heavy clay and we're looking at less than a tenth of an inch of infiltration per hour, and our rainfall is even at that 1/10 of an inch mark or just a little bit above that, we're going to be dealing with runoff. So, all these things that Doug talked about, soil aeration and just, good organic matter in your soils, and these things that can help improve the infiltration rate will help you very, very greatly in the long term. Now, depending on the texture of soils that you have, it's going to cause you to manage that irrigation much differently, right? So on coarse lands, we have high infiltration rates, but as you would assume, we have a low capacity to hold water. So because of that low water holding capacity, you might be leaning towards more frequent applications. And then with finer textured soils like clays or loamy clays, silty clays, whatever they are, they have medium to low water holding capacity. And they can be very difficult to irrigate properly, right? So multiple cycles is certainly an option here, and I really, really like this approach. I know the golf guys, especially on putting greens, do this quite often. So if you've got a poor infiltrating soil, let's call it a 1/10 of an inch per hour, and your ET value told you needed to replace a 1/3 of an inch for that particular day, then one way to accomplish that would be to irrigate with a 1/10 of an inch for whatever time that is, 15, 20 minutes, and then you would let that soak for a 1/2 hour, right? Or for an hour. And then that same night, you're going to run another cycle right on top of that, another 10 or 15 minutes with a 1/10 of an inch. And, we're getting more towards that 1/3 of an inch replenishment there. And then you might let it soak for a 1/2 hour, another hour, and then you would put your final 1/3 of an inch on there. So that's one way to kind of get around this poor infiltrating soils, but still the desire to put down sufficient water volume. I like the practice because then you're not irrigating every odd day or every day, right? If you put just that 1/10 of an inch down because after that you've got runoff, then there's not enough water in your soil to sustain your turf for any length of time. So unfortunately, you have to come back and water that next day or that every other day type of program. That's kind of the main point there. Soil infiltration rates, with coarse sands, we're looking at 1 inch an hour and well above that, 30 to 50 inches an hour. You can even, get up to some of those numbers. Fine sands might be a 1/2 inch to 3 inches or so. And then as we get down to some of these heavier soils, you might be 1/100th of an inch or a 1/10 of an inch per hour, for example, with soils. If you're really curious to see what the infiltration rate of your soil is, this is kind of the standard procedure for that. I'm really surprised that we don't have any other tools than this, I guess, or we've got one tool that I'll talk about in the next slide, but it's a pretty basic procedure, right? So you've got these 2 rings, we call it the double ring infiltrometer. You can find these online. They're not overly cheap, but I suppose you could make your own out of coffee cans or whatever. And basically you're pouring water into the center one, into both rings. You're kind of saturating the soil. And then once you've got the soil, what you've considered saturated, you record the time, you fill it back up, and then you record the time that it takes with your ruler here on the side for the water to go down in a saturated soil. And we call that, your stabilized infiltration rate. Okay, so that's what we're using with the double ring infiltrometers to determine your infiltration rate. Here's one out of Turf Tech, is a company out of Florida. I'm not sure what they call it. They just call it the infiltrometer. I've used them. The University of Minnesota has 2 of them. They're pretty dang easy. So I liked them. It's a simple setup. All it is your ruler is up here. You've got a ball down here that floats in the water. So you read the water level here, and then you've got just a kitchen timer right here that records the time for the water to drop. So, but those can be fairly useful tools. And then this is just another point Doug mentioned, that silt loams or silty soils really have the most plant available water, so we would probably talk about, some of our higher quality lawns being built with these soils. So these are kind of these processes we talked about earlier, right? So we've got field capacity is this top bar here. So field capacity in a sand-based system might be 10%, for example, right? And that just means that's the amount of water that my soil will hold after gravity has moved water through it. So very, very low there, right? When I get down to, for example, 6% here, volumetric water content in the soil, I'm getting to about half of my plant available water. That's what this 50% available water is indicating, that line there. And then when I get down to 4% in my soil with sands, we're getting to a point of permanent wilting point. Now, the reason it works this way is because with the finer textured soil particles, they hold on to water so much more tightly. So even in a clay soil here, if I've got 20% water still in my soil, those clay particles might be holding onto that water so tightly that my roots aren't able to withdraw that. So I'm getting to a permanent wilting point still with 20% water in my soil. But ultimately, the most plant available water is achieved kind of right here in the middle with the silt loam or more silty type of soils here. Okay. And this is just a graphic example from one of these turf textbooks. That main point there. Field capacity for sands might be 10%. If you irrigate with a bunch of water in the effort to get your soil moisture levels in a sand to 20 or 30%, I'm here to tell you it's going to be very, very short-lived, right? Because your infiltration rate is such that gravity is going to move that through pretty quick. Permanent wilting point might be that 4%, and here's kind of what we talked about with those clay soils as well. So hopefully that makes sense to everybody. And then the last topic here on soils is just understanding that in some of our more high-profile turf settings where we really try to do a good job of pushing our soils to the point of dry down before watering them again, we can get some water repellent soils. We call that hydrophobic soils, where they really become resistant to latching onto that water. So it can be a significant challenge. Mainly sand root zones is why we see some of these water repellent soils. Water repellency certainly can occur in fine texture soils as well. And if you're into a more of a high profile turf setting, wetting agents are really, really valuable tools that we've used in the turf industry for over 6 or 7 decades to help sort of achieve that goal. So if you're sand-based root zone, sports field or whatever, wetting agents I think Doug would agree, he's done a lot of wetting agent research too. You get on a good monthly program with wetting agents and you'll reap the benefits as far as turf quality goes, soil moisture uniformity, and then just sheer water savings as well. Before I go any further, Doug, did you have anything you wanted to mention on that soil topic?
No, not really. I think you did a good job of reviewing some of the stuff we talked about in the soils lecture. No questions in the chat yet either.
Excellent. Okay. So now we'll get into this art and science of irrigation here. So as turf managers, we're really looking at effective irrigation, and we can define effective irrigation quite simply as, all of the water that we applied is consumed and used by the turf, right? But that's an ideal world situation and not achievable. But current encouraging ourselves to try to get there is how we can really get better. So this implies that none of our water is lost through runoff. Okay, we can achieve that by, these soak and cycle options or improving our soils. Deep percolation as well occurs, and that's a water loss, evaporation, and then some of our system inefficiencies which occur out there at a great rate. Maximum effectiveness implies a relative uniformity in plant available moisture. And I think, we all know that due to some of these system inefficiencies, it's very, very hard to achieve, and especially with our inconsistent soils that we built on all of our lawns, that all of our lawns are built on. But this should be your goal of effective irrigation. So uniform distribution with our irrigation system. And then, the other factor here is these site conditions. Basically what happens to water after it leaves the nozzle of your irrigation system kind of determine its fate. So there's a lot of controversy in this, and my plan is to not confuse anybody here and not to open up too much of a can of worms. But we talk about, watering strategies as either deep and infrequent versus shallow and frequent watering. I spent a lot of time in the practical setting, managing golf courses and other settings, and spent a lot of time in the side of academia as well. I'm still always going to be a deep and infrequent guy because I've just seen the value at really encouraging root growth and encouraging resistance to drought stress by what this process we call root training, right? So root training is when you're allowing soils to dry down to a point of near wilt before we apply that next cycle. And what you'll find is, as the soils dry down, your root systems are going to grow deeper for moisture, and you will be able to irrigate less frequently because of that, right? Excuse me. This is that point where I said, those that overwater from a frequency standpoint have to continue overwatering, right? So if we're on a watering program of every odd day, the root system doesn't need to go anywhere for moisture because you're constantly supplying it. The consequence with that is certainly, as we talked about, poor turf health, diseases, weeds, insects, just bad rooting in general. But also if our irrigation system goes down, or if we're trying to save water and we get into a drought situation, our plants are not prepared to survive that drought at all. So, the challenge becomes, and this is where all the art comes into play here. So is deep and infrequent, is that once a day or is that once a week? Well, it all depends on the particular settings, right? Your soil type, your climate factors, the time of year that come into play here. Generally, I'm going to say push yourself to apply water as infrequent as possible while still maintaining the health that you're looking for. But the only way you can get to an infrequent standpoint is to replenish the soil moisture with sufficient volumes that get down to 6 or 12 inches in your soil where the root system is there, right? But then quite often, if you're not irrigating to that depth, you'll find that rainfall happens frequent enough to get down there in some cases as well. But just be sure that you're not on one of those programs where you're not putting down enough water and thinking you're going to get to an infrequent standpoint, because if you're only wetting 1 inch or 2 inches of your soil, then the infrequency of irrigation is not very practical. So you're looking for a ½ inch or 1 inch of just moisture applied to the surface to get down to depths of 6 inches or greater. And a lot of soil type comes into play there. Multiple cycles, we talked about that. In the summer, when our root systems of our cool season grasses, might generally kind of, tend to reside, you're looking at probably increasing the frequency and reducing volume, switching to that more shallow and infrequent approach, the more shallow and frequent approach, if your expectations for your lawn are very high and you can't simply let it go brown and go dormant. But I'm here to tell you that it takes really some pretty serious drought conditions to actually lose turf due to a lack of water. And that goes just back to the meme. Okay. And then generally you're going to want to irrigate in the early morning hours to have the most whatever value, I guess, from the water you're applying or from reduction in diseases, right? So daytime is certainly less efficient because you're going to have more evaporation with just the solar radiation there and the wind speed. You might get some wind deflection with your irrigation heads there as well. And then conversely, if we're applying water in the late afternoon or early evening, the challenge becomes that your turf, it sits there wet all night long until it has a chance to dry out the next day, right? So you might get more moss, more algae because of that. You might have more weeds and more diseases that like that particular environment as well. The only exception I'll say is if you're trying to irrigate 100 or 150 acres of turf, and you might have to run an 8-hour irrigation cycle just to effectively accomplish everything. So main point there would be choose your most important surfaces, your putting greens maybe, that get irrigated, in the early morning hours. From a home lawn standpoint, I like to encourage people to set the irrigation systems up kind of around that time when generally you're up and you're out of your bed and you're having breakfast, because at least if you're, sitting on your kitchen table and it rained the day before, at least you'll see if your rain sensor isn't working, or if you should, or at least you can go out there and if you can see if you've got a leak in your system, or you can run to your garage and shut the controller off, right? I see way too many irrigation systems set up for 4 or 5 in the morning, and homeowners and government buildings, whatever they are, commercial buildings, don't even know that the irrigation system ran that morning after we received 2 inches of rain. So I'm encouraging people to go more towards that 6 or 7 a.m. time frame with it, just from a sheer just from a standpoint of being able to see it. All right, so without any questions, we're going to go into this whole scheduling irrigation thing. So, determining when and how much is really an art, that we kind of talked about. There are a lot of different tools that you can use to your ability, and they're really becoming economical now. Cities are even offering rebates to get smart controllers or to get soil moisture sensors. So I encourage you to have a look at some of those, try to save some of your clients some money there. We're going to talk about scheduling irrigation, as kind of 4 different options here. But what I will say is, the best approach to scheduling irrigation in an art form type of sense would be to utilize all 4 of these methods in some capacity, right? So, and actually I need to give credit to Dr. Tom Nicolai at Michigan State University, as sort of the one that introduced these 4 methods to me here. He has a great irrigation webinar on GCSAA, I believe, for example. So check that out if you have time. GCSAA is the Golf Course Superintendents Association of America. So we've got field method 1, we have field method 2, we have evapotranspiration data, and then we have sensor technology. So field method 1 is what I'm showing here. This is a soil profiler. It really means just getting your hands dirty and going out there and measuring the moisture status of your lawn. I think that this is actually kind of a forgotten practice, and it's I would like to see more people sticking a profiler, or this is a young graduate student, Sam here, I believe, but sticking a soil probe in the ground. This is a 3/4 inch soil probe. And I think a soil probe is a forgotten tool. Too many of us nowadays associate brown with dry, and we increase our irrigation programs because of it, when dryness was never the reason for that turf being brown. So one way to determine that is to stick a probe in the ground, and is the soil wet or not? It's cheap, it's easy, it's very reassuring. Unfortunately, we just, some of us, we're not at our properties that often, but the drawbacks are everyone has a different feel, so what's sufficient moisture to me might be not sufficient to you. There's a lot of local knowledge that comes into play here. And there's no quantifiable value. So if the soil is dry, how much water do I replace it with, right? You're not answering that question. And that's why using, all of these different methods in some capacity has some value. Field method 2 is really kind of, this Zen-like state, right? So you're not sticking a probe in the ground, but based on driving around your properties that, hey, it's a hot summer day, my lawn's going to look pretty dang bad. My 30 clients' lawns, my 500 clients' lawns are going to look pretty dang bad tomorrow if those irrigation systems aren't running. Okay, so local knowledge that comes into play here. It's also very, very cheap and easy. This is a picture actually from Dr. Patton out of Purdue, showing a soil's getting to that point of almost permanent wilting point, probably not quite there yet. But this is what we call, looking for footprints. And I'll tell you, if you push your lawn, basically you step on the lawn and the grass doesn't rebound or doesn't bounce back like it normally would if it was well hydrated. I'll tell you, if you push your lawns to this point and you water them the next day, you're not going to lose any turf quality whatsoever, and you're probably going to have a much better root system if you operate like this. The challenge is we're just, some of you are at your properties well enough to where you can irrigate like this. Okay, my soil's dry. Let's water tonight or tomorrow morning and replace that. And that's a great program. Unfortunately, for some, the lawn care folks, we're just not at our clients' properties that much. So again, local knowledge, so it can be subjective. There's no quantifiable value, and it can be risky. In some cases, you can lose some turf, right? And then method number 3 here is kind of this evapotranspiration data. So whether you want to use some of those models that we talked about, like Dr. Woods' model from that he developed. I found this. This is an app here. Also, it's a New Holland agriculture app. This is for St. Paul, Minnesota, from I don't know, a year ago or so, years ago. But this is the ETP. So that's the evapotranspiration potential is what they're indicating there. And in this case, we're 0.8 millimeters per day, which is pretty low. We're real low. We're down to less than 500ths of an inch, for example. Okay. But benefits, real values. This is a weather station. This is a tool from Spectrum you could put outside your shop. So Spectrum Technologies, I think, sells this here. It's just their ET gauge. You fill it with water. It has some mechanisms in here that measure humidity or wind speed and solar radiation and all that as a model. And you just record it one day and you go there and see what the value is the next day, right? Can be a good indicator there. So quick, easy, automatic. The drawbacks, they're model based. So we're not actually measuring the sites. We're using a weather station in our proximity or an app in our proximity. It can be expensive if we're retrofitting weather stations, and they will vary by site. Then the last method here is really just this sensor technology. So whether you're using the portable moisture sensors, this is a TDR probe from Spectrum, whether you're using, kind of the mini weather stations here or sensor technologies that are linked up with these. So you can link rain sensors would be the bare minimum. We'll talk more about that. Now you can find soil moisture sensors from, a lot of the different manufacturers out there. Toro and Rainbird and Hunter all make soil moisture sensors. The nice thing there is you plug the soil moisture sensor in, you set your irrigation program up to water every odd day. And if the moisture sensor reads sufficient in your soil, it won't let your irrigation system run on that odd day. So that's one way to solve that issue of that lawn I talked about, having to drive around that flooded road. So if their expectations are really high and they're nervous to not get off of that every odd day program, then plug in a moisture sensor and you should feel pretty safe there. Drawbacks, some of them can be expensive, but they're getting really economical now. And like I said, cities can have rebates. They can also be affected by your soil type and some salts in the soil, specifically some of that TDR type of technology is influenced by salts in your soil. So that's something to think about as well. And then just a couple ideas here, setting, there are a million different ways to set your irrigation objectives, right? You can set irrigation objectives by your expectations. You can set them by seasons. You can set them by surface area, right? So the golf guys would have different objectives for greens than they would have for fairways, tees, and rough. Different objectives for sports and things like that. So this is irrigation objectives by expectations for lawns, right? For example, if you have a high maintenance lawn, you might be irrigating as much as needed to promote that green color and a healthy turf. Try to utilize some of this technology to help you save water long term. Medium maintenance lawns, you might only be irrigating, in the middle of the summer there, where I showed from that graph when, we might be losing upwards of around 6 inches of moisture in a month from our lawns, for example. And you might get some browning there as well. For low maintenance lawns, I think it's certainly very practical with the right soil prep or the right amendments to that soil and with the right grass species to have no irrigation. I've gone into townhome associations here in Minnesota in the Anoka Sand Plain, and the irrigation contractor is telling them they're in the Anoka Sand Plain. They need to have water every other day. Otherwise their lawns are not going to look very good. If they have 40 homes, I walk in there and I say, shut 5 of them off and call me when those 5 get dry. And it usually takes a month or 2, just depending on the season and whether it rains or not. Some of them I never hear from. And I definitely don't hear from any of them inside of a week. I'll tell you that for sure. But it just takes little case studies like that to convince people that they're drastically overwatering their lawns and their turf health is suffering because of it. Not to mention their water bill and the withdrawal from groundwater aquifers, and applied on impervious surfaces or whatever, going down to the Gulf of Mexico. So little soapboxy there for me, I guess, but hopefully that puts things in perspective. You might set irrigation objectives by season, right? And if I'm in a sports field setting, this might be kind of how I generally base that for the particular seasons. In the spring, we get a lot of rains, like that graph showed in April and May, at least in our area. Our plant demands are really, really low, meaning our ET rates are going to be low at that time. So you're going to probably be irrigating infrequently. Our main goal is to try to, promote rooting, and that's what we're doing with that infrequent approach. On the flip side, if you're trying to germinate seed in any capacity, in the sports field capacity, if you've lost grass or if you have, wear damage from last fall's football season, then the germinate seed, you're going to want to be on a light, frequent program that's a couple times per day at really, really light rates until your turf germinates and establishes. In the summer, you might be increasing frequency, like we talked about, and reducing your volumes to account for that shorter root system. You might be applying some type of water in the afternoon, just depending on what grass species you have. If you have a good quality 100% stand of Kentucky bluegrass, you might not have that requirement. If you've got ryegrass and fescues and POA mixed in there, you might need to think about some of these afternoon irrigations just due to the nature of some of those grasses, whether it's shallow root systems or just, not the best performance in heat type scenarios. And then in the fall here, you're going to transition back to infrequent applications. The one thing you need to just keep an eye on is you really don't want to push your turf past the point of wilt in the fall, because there just isn't enough time to recover that before winter comes in most cases. If you're August, September, you're probably fine. But, if you're getting into late September, at least in my area, and you're getting into October and you're really pushing your turf to the point of wilt, the chances of recovering that prior to winter might not be there. And turf going into winter in a drought state or in a wilted state is going to have a much less chance of surviving that winter. Okay. Now we're getting into irrigation systems. I just want to pull this down for just a second here. So we're working through the content here pretty good. Appreciate everybody hanging in with me here. We're at 48 slides or out of 80 or so. Doug, anything you wanted to bring up or anything before I just keep cruising here?
No, just to, reiterate your point. I liked your story of you said, hey, turn off 5 of them and call me when you see a problem. That's perfect. When I have friends or family members with irrigation systems, they'll say, how should I set it up? I just say, well, just turn it off. And then you just use it when you need it, like when you start to see a problem. And it's amazing. People think you got to go every 3 days, and it's so not true. But people put in that controller and that technology, they think it's a crime if you don't populate it with instructions. So take some education.
Yeah, and that's just it, right? These homeowners, they have a lot, and here's where it all comes from. They have a lot of pride in their property, and they paid for the irrigation system, so they want to use it. It's just, there's been so much information along the way that, of the requirement to have a nice quality lawn, that we kind of deviated off course here, I think. So yeah, all great points there. And I realize a lot of us aren't, if we're lawn care operators, we're not directly managing that irrigation program, but we have an influence on our recommendations to homeowners. And what I'll say is most our irrigation controllers are in the garage of our clients, right? And they're driving into their garage every single day. And like Doug said, turn that, we call it manual operation, right? Turn that thing off. You come home one afternoon and your lawn looks dry, flip it on and let it run the next morning, right? And then turn it off before you go to work again. You'll have a much better lawn versus the every other day type of program, most certainly. And, everybody says, well, what if the homeowner's not home, or what if they forget and the lawn was dry one day, but they didn't see it? Well, then go 2-3 days without irrigation, right? It's not the end of the world. It's very rare to see turf loss from drought, depending on species, I suppose. But yeah. Now we're getting into irrigation systems, and just a couple main points here, right? So the key components of our irrigation systems are 5 things that we really need to think about, okay? So it's the design and the engineering of that system. And a lot of that happens before our time, or I know there are irrigation contractors in here as well. So we have some way to influence the design of that systems. Water management, those questions of, how often and how much, the volume and frequency question. And then our equipment, the pipes, valves, controllers, installation comes into play of that, and then longer term maintenance of that system. So all 5 of these things, if any one of them is not done correctly, they're going to have a negative impact on water use efficiency, right? So ultimately our efficiency is going to be much better in most cases. Pretty bad generalization here, I suppose, but the more sprinklers we have, the more efficient we can be with that. So if we're trying to save money and putting in a new system and we start crossing off sprinklers on our design plan, then longer term, we might have more issues with that, right? More sprinklers doesn't mean you're using more water. It usually means you're becoming more efficient, and you'll be able to reduce your run times, right? Instead of 15 minutes or 30 minutes, you're maybe running 5 or 10 minutes because you're more efficient and you're putting out more water. So some things to think about there, I suppose. So anyway, 3 primary types of sprinklers that we talk about. So we've got these fixed spray nozzles, fixed spray sprinklers. They don't turn at all. They just kind of pop up and they spray. We see these used a lot on the sides of houses, whatever, 3-6 foot wide turf areas, between the sides of houses, or we see these used a lot for landscape plants, planting beds. They're these, some of them are on risers and so forth, but they don't turn when they rotate. We've got these impact rotors, which I think, and if some irrigation contractors are on tonight, certainly correct me if I'm wrong here, but as an industry, we're really going away from these impact rotors. But the best way to describe an impact rotor is those cheap sprinklers that you buy at your big box stores, Home Depot or Menards or something, that you plug into your spigot and they do the ch-ch-ch-ch-ch. So that sprinkler moves based on an arm hitting the stream of the water and causing it to move, right? So and then we have gear rotors, and that's what most of our lawn sprinklers would be, smaller type of residential gear rotors, or our sports fields would be larger gear rotors. Our golf folks use the largest gear rotors of these. For most homeowner rotors, they're going to have single nozzles, and for the more professional type of turf, parks, grounds, sports fields, and golf, you would have possibly multiple nozzles. They might have multiple streams, right? 2 to 8 nozzles, for example, with different stream designs. Generally, the more streams you have, you're going to have better water placement. And a lot of the irrigation manufacturers would have literature showing you the uniformity of their sprinkler heads. Based on, here's a picture, an example of these fixed spray nozzles. A lot of people just call them pop-ups. Also, so residential applications almost exclusively, 3 to 18 foot spacing with these. They're generally going to be putting down a lot of water, right? So we see values up to 10 inches per hour. I'll say probably more like 2 to 3 inches per hour with most of the system designs that I've seen. Very, very low DU or distribution uniformity compared to rotors. Okay, so they're just less efficient or less uniform with these, and they have lower operating pressures. So, this might be more like 20 to 40 psi to get one of these to pop up, versus 40 to 60 psi for some of the more rotor type heads. And then these are the rotor heads here, right? So this one on the right actually is one you can buy at your big box stores. I wouldn't rely on this type of head long term. It's a poor man's irrigation head is kind of what it really is. Not to knock on Rainbird, right? Every company has inferior or more economical sprinklers they sell to the marketplace. Rainbird has some great sprinklers as well, as does Toro and Hunter. But this is one of those impact ones, so you can set these springs on this depending on the arc or the radius that you want that sprinkler to cover. You might have a radius of 18 to 100 feet with these. You have generally lower precipitation rates, so we're looking at more like a lot of the designs I've seen, 1/2 inch per hour up to 1.5 inches per hour, but generally we're under that inch per hour range. The geared rotors are more common, and we're usually having higher operating pressures with these. The last thing I'm going to say on the rotors here is the golf ones, or in some cases our sports turf ones even, they have a valve inside these individual sprinkler heads, right? So when I push a button on my radio or on my irrigation controller and tell this sprinkler to pop up, there's a valve in the body of this sprinkler that will allow just one sprinkler to pop up. As a manager, that translates to me to efficiency, right? I can run this sprinkler for more or less time than I can run this sprinkler, right? Because they have individual valves in them. So that's pretty neat with some of these larger heads. With more residential applications, usually you have an electric valve that opens up in the ground, and it controls 5 to 8 sprinklers, right? So, and we call those zones, right? So you might have 6 to 8 zones in a homeowner's property, for example. So if you want to manipulate the runtime, you have to do it on a zone basis. So zone 1, you can set to 30 minutes, and zone 2, if it's in the backyard in the shade, you can set to 20 minutes or 10 minutes. But just keep in mind that there are 6 or 8 sprinklers or more or less, depending on the amount of pressure you have in the system with that. So those are not valve in head sprinklers. They're controlled by a single electric. Uniformity, basic concept, looking to apply water as evenly as possible. As you would assume, most scheduling is driven by dry spots. I got a dry spot in my lawn. Let's up the runtime here. The consequence of that is applying, more water to these dry spots over irrigates everything else. Okay, so your goal as turf managers is really try to, again, back to Doug's oils, we're trying to decrease the difference between our minimum and maximum wetness, right? So uniformity when we construct soil aeration to try to increase uniformity. Wetting agents might come into play here, as well, and even uniformity adjustments with your irrigation systems. Okay, I'm not much of an advocate for wetting agents for home lawns. I think there are other things that would help your program, or that I'd probably perceive as more value to a homeowner that I'd be more comfortable charging them for. I've seen some suppliers out there really tout the whole, if you apply wetting agents to lawns, you can save 30 to 50% of the water. And I don't think that way. I don't think Doug thinks that way either. I would say shut the controller off and you can save 60 to 70% water. If you want to save more water beyond that, then and you had to turn the controller on more often than you wanted to, then maybe a wetting agent would come into play here. But I don't think it's a great trade-off to apply a wetting agent to think you're going to save water in lawns. I think generally we can do much better before we get to that wetting agent conversation. Conversely, for high-profile turf settings, I think wetting agents are really, really valuable tools. If I was a sports turf manager, for example, in the Twin Cities here, Target Field, Allianz Field, CHS Field, wetting agents are going to be a big component to my program in these sand-based systems. Let's see if I could. And then uniformity, just a good graph or good picture, diagram here from the Irrigation Association. So what we're looking for is uniform wetting. We're irrigating in most cases to these dry spots here. And back to some of that soils conversation, if I can pull some cores from this soil, incorporate some organic matter in here, I might be able to achieve, better uniform moisture wetting by accomplishing that. The reality of it is, in most cases, if you see this in a lawn and you take some time to investigate what's going on, whether you're doing catch can tests or whether you're, just looking at how the sprinklers are covering this area, I think you're going to find that the uniformity of the irrigation system is probably not that great in this area. So some adjustments to the irrigation system itself can usually help to accomplish that. Now, here's some charts here just to talk about uniformity of some of these different irrigation controllers. Little outdated charts, but really the irrigation industry, it's hard to get uniform systems, and you could probably say that these values are a little bit better nowadays, but not a lot better. For example, distribution uniformity of 85% uniform wetting of my surfaces, that we would call excellent or achievable. We'll still call that excellent and achievable today. For a golf setting, for example, if we have some of these larger golf or large turf grass rotors, very good to be 80%, kind of expected would be 75%. We're kind of still in that range. If you're getting down in that 60% range or less than that, I think some uniformity adjustments will help you out. And then, just as we reduce the size of our sprinklers, we're seeing a lower uniformity rate here. As we spoke about, fixed spray heads are much less uniform than our larger type of sprinklers. Okay. Now, this is uniformity, and we're going to get into auditing an irrigation system. If you're putting tuna cans or dedicated cans for measuring the moisture that's put down over your lawn surfaces. I know that Doug would tell you that the irrigation system uniformity is one thing, but if that's all we're looking at, we're sort of missing the boat, because the reality of it is the only thing that really matters is the uniformity of your soil moisture and how that's wetting. So you could have, a really what we would call poor uniformity of an irrigation system, but the turf manager has enough knowledge that he's manipulated that above ground irrigation system enough to target those dry areas in the soil, and the uniformity values on the surface might be very bad. But if you stick different soil probes in the soil, you might be pretty surprised at how you get that. And I don't have Doug's picture in here showing that, but it's now when we talk about some of these technologies that are out there and available, we've talked about all these, so I'm going to kind of just skip that. Know that there are smart controllers available to you. There are hundreds of smart controllers out there and available in the marketplace. So do some research, find one. We've come a long way since these old Rainbird RC 1260s, in the 1980s. I went around about 2 years ago in the Twin Cities here and did homeowner irrigation audits. This controller in the basement of a master gardener's house. And I'm like, you're a master gardener, with these, you pull the pins out and you really don't know what time the irrigation system is going to go off. You just kind of have general guidelines. I'm like, dude, you can come up with $100 to replace this thing. And that's a pretty easy sell, right? So we've come a long way in just about 20, this thing says 30 years, but we're about 40 years, since these were out and available as well. These are what some of these moisture sensors and rain sensors kind of look like. The one on the top here is the Toro Precision Soil Moisture Sensor. It's $100 or $150. You stick this puck in the soil, and you step on it just like it looks here, flat. You mow right over top of it. These probes measure the moisture. It's wireless. The issue with that is you got to be sure you replace the batteries and kind of keep it location. Keep an eye on its location. But then this transmitter or whatever they call it, receiver would connect up to your irrigation system. It'll tell you the moisture value. The reason I like these is because you could set it up for every odd day for 1/3 of an inch, do a little bit of playing around with the moisture value on this to see at what point the lawn gets dry. And you can, set that, add it to a homeowner's system, It's pretty easy to add these. You just put it in the rain sensor port in most cases. And then feel comfortable not going to your client's lawn for a month, and feel comfortable that I guess I don't care a whole lot if your client, if it's drying out much. I'm just, more concerned that, that program isn't running every odd day when it's been raining 4 inches that week, right? So this is kind of, these are some good fail safes for that. Do your research and find out ones that you like the best. I've had some people tell me that they aren't fans of the wireless ones because, the homeowner forgets where they are, the batteries wear out, and after a year or two, they just don't see them being utilized anymore. So one way around that would be some of these hardwire ones like that Rainbird one. Rain sensors are the bare minimum. I'm not much of a fan of a rain sensor, to be completely honest with you. Now, in Minnesota, we have a rain sensor law. It looks like, we call it the rain sensor law, but it's a sensor law. And it looks like this. So it says all automatically operated landscape irrigation systems shall have furnished and installed technology that inhibits or interrupts operation of the landscape irrigation system during periods of sufficient moisture. Okay. The technology must be adjustable by the end user or by the practitioner of the landscape service. Okay. So we call, and this was effective July 31st, 2003 in Minnesota, signed into law by, it was Jesse the Body Ventura, who was the Minnesota governor at that point in time, I believe. But I think the law is fine because the law allows for any sensor. It doesn't have to be a rain sensor, even though we call it a rain sensor law. The reason I don't like rain sensors is because I think we give them way too much credit, and people have them installed, right? And they don't work that good. They're $20. They're $30. You put them on your rooftop, you set your irrigation system for every odd day, and it might, rain and interrupt the operation of your system, one day during a rain event or whatever, but then the system would just come right back on, I think, too quick. My issue with these is they allow the homeowner to sleep well at night knowing their irrigation system is on. And what I mean by that, they set it for every odd day and they sleep well saying I have a rain sensor. In the reality, their system should just be off. And then usually what they'll tell you is, well, I don't know how to operate my system and I've got a rain sensor. Well, my argument to them is with most of these controllers, off is just one click to the left, so make a click to the left there, forget about the rain sensor and that you have. If you want to keep it on and you're worried about your lawn getting dry, then do it every odd day program, but have a soil moisture sensor instead of a. Here's something I saw. Actually, a friend, buddy of mine, Paul Ekholm, sent this to me. He works in our Teca companies up here in Minnesota. This is a homeowner supposedly thinking they're compliant with the rain sensor legislation. So they wired the rain sensor inside of the box so that it never got wet and shut the system down. So this is not compliant, and unhooked the rain sensor here. Looking at it is just dumb, right? I don't know anything other to say than that it's just dumb, so don't do that. Now, I did some tests in Minnesota with like 6 different irrigation systems, for example. So the traditional automatic irrigation system set up to wad every odd day at 1/3 of an inch in just 2 months here. In this case, it had no rain sensor, and I find like 50% of homeowners in my area have no sensor at all. It used 13 inches of water with that traditional every odd day program set up to 1/3 of an inch, which totals your 1 inch per week, on most weeks there, 13 inches in 2 months. When you add just a simple soil moisture sensor to that exact same system, this was the exact same system, we saved 10 inches of water in 2 months. And the lawn in this case looked better, right? So that's easy. That's easy to spend $100 on a soil moisture sensor.
Hey, Sam, go back to that though. Which one won?
Yeah, there you go. So this is what Doug and I have been harping on this point all along. So the traditional manual system, what I didn't talk about, I'm just trying to be sure I get through all my content here. The traditional manual system was exactly the same system. It was just in off mode. And you look at this in 2 months. So what that means is off mode. If the lawn looked dry in this test, I was going there and flipping it on. Okay. So, and it was set to about 1/2 of an inch. So this means I flipped it on 3 times. Flipped it on 3 times in 2 months here. And I will tell you, this was like 2 years ago or something. If I flipped this thing on 3 times in 2 months, it must have been a pretty dang dry fall, because normally I would have flipped it on 1 time, you know? So thanks, Doug, for pointing that out. I think that's a really good point. And yes, admittingly, there was probably a minor reduction in lawn quality from System 5 versus System 6. And if you're looking for the most pristine, never get that minor reduction, then go with System 6, right? But I would choose System 5 all day long. Irrigation uniformity, generally, this is just one slide that I have on kind of the, the design and how that affects it. You're looking for head-to-head coverage. Excuse me. Get more uniform. So each of these green dots is a sprinkler head you're looking to throw to that next sprinkler head. Now, generally, triangular spacing of irrigation systems is going to be much more uniform than our square spacing. Okay, this is just kind of like irrigation design 101. Triangular systems are going to apply water more uniformly than square systems generally. And then this is kind of what we're showing with that sprinkler. So system A here, here's one sprinkler shooting, kind of just over the middle here, and here's sprinkler B. Well, no matter what type of manufacturer sprinkler you have, what type of nozzles you have, just the nature of sprinklers and the way water pressure works and forcing that stream out, you always have more water applied, right around that sprinkler head. Okay. So the best way to kind of get uniformity, so we've got less water here in the middle. As we get further away from that sprinkler, less water is applied. The best way to achieve good uniformity is to have, kind of this head-to-head coverage, or just barely head-to-head sprinkler to sprinkler coverage to accommodate for the fact that sprinklers tend to put out more water directly adjacent to that sprinkler head. And then nozzles, if you're using larger heads or something to think about, we've got these things called precipitation rate nozzles as well that a lot of the manufacturers have out there and available. And we won't talk about that anymore, but if you're using if you're using a lot of fixed spray heads, have a look at those matched precipitation rate nozzles. I think there's value there. But as nozzles wear over time, the openings get bigger and bigger. So here's an example sprinkler head in the middle and more water with the dark blue here. So replacing the nozzles or replacing that individual sprinkler head can get you back to a much more uniform type of system. This is something most of us never even think about for easily 10, in some cases 20 years, unless the sprinkler is leaking. So yeah, maybe you want to just think about it sooner than that, right? And as much as irrigation technology is increasing on a yearly basis here, the technology that's 10 years old can be quite outdated. Ultimately, our goal as practitioners is to catch problems like this, before you can visually see them. So that's where irrigation audits come into play. And that's kind of what we're going to talk about more here, right? So, but just 2 very, very extreme examples. I don't know what's going on here, but these are pictures that I borrowed from somewhere. There's a sprinkler head in the middle. I would say probably low operating pressure or a clogged stream, because it's just, we call this a donut. It's just kind of irrigating around that, in just one line. I'd say probably low pressure is the culprit there. And then, irrigation auditing procedures, there are basically 3 steps to audit an irrigation system. And it's pretty simple. Depending on what your setting is, lawn care, commercial buildings, sports turf, grounds and parks, you might do this every year. You might do it every 3 years. You might do it every 5 years, right? This whole process. But step 1 to me is the most important. Okay. So if you never go around and you never place catch cans anywhere, and you don't want to go just the time commitment that's involved with auditing irrigation systems, then at the very least, run the sprinklers, make sure you don't have any geysers, make sure that the arcs are in alignment. You're not watering the driveway or the street. That happens a lot as well. So the site inspection is really, the best place to start if you don't have, whether you're doing a full-blown irrigation audit or if you don't have time to do the catch can test. Okay, so we're looking at all the components, making sure they were operating as they were initially designed. We might be checking out the programs in the controllers as well. Then we do this catch can test, right? You might call it performance testing. And generally, I'll say the longer you run the sprinklers for, the greater accuracy you're going to have, just due to kind of the starts and stops of the sprinklers, where they start in the rotation. And a 1/2 inch of water is a lot easier to measure than a 1/10 of an inch of water in a cup. But from this, you're going to calculate the precipitation rate. Okay, so usually that's in inches per hour. So the amount of moisture that's applied on an hourly basis from that irrigation system. Every irrigation system is different, so that's why I like measuring it. You've got to measure it. And then we're also looking at a uniformity here. But the number one question I receive related to homeowners irrigation is, how long should I run my irrigation system for? And that's a really tough question to answer, because you're going to see precipitation rates for 1/2 inch per hour all the way up to 2.5 inches per hour. So 10 minutes, we're not comparing apples to apples there, right? So it's really pretty good to know that value. And you might be able to figure that out by just placing a few cans, 5 or 10 cans out there during a morning cycle, for example, and not have to dedicate too much to it. And then scheduling, right? So from the values you receive from the tests, then you're going to go and you're going to schedule specific run times for each particular zone. Okay. With this system inspection, here are all the things you're kind of, looking for: broken sprinklers, leaky seals, worn nozzles, your arc adjustments, right? From my studies, 61 homeowners I did irrigation audits for in the 7-county metro area here. The average homeowner waters with an irrigation system waters 500 square feet of impervious surface. Right now, that's not to say that that number is drastically high or drastically low. You're always going to have some impervious surface being watered. I think we can get much lower than that. There was one homeowner I found that was watering 2,000 square feet of driveway, sidewalk, and patio. 2,000 square feet, because their irrigation system was set up at 4 a.m. Nobody ever saw it run. And it was just, it's easy to play ignorant in that case, right? I guess. And then we have higher low pressures. We should check, higher low rotating speed, malfunctioning valves. You might do this audit every 3 years, I guess maybe would be my recommendation for a home lawn where you're doing all the catch can tests. But I'm going to do this at least every spring when I start up the irrigation system. Now, a lot of participants in the class from all across the nation and internationally, but we need to, in Minnesota, at least in Wisconsin, where Doug is at too, we need to clean the irrigation water out of our pipes before winter so the pipes don't freeze. So when you go to the property to charge that system back up, that's the time where I'd be going through every individual zone and just making sure we don't have any problems. Okay, that's the bare minimum. Surprised to know the number of geysers that go unmissed from April to October. And that's, we're not talking about 100 gallons an hour being lost in that setting. We're talking about thousands of gallons being lost when the sprinkler is broken, and you have a geyser coming out of it. So here's what the catch can test looked like. Just a golf course setting in the background for a putting green. Basically, with the values from this, we're calculating, this lower quartile or our distribution uniformity from using the lowest 25% of our cans with those values. And this is what that looks like. Okay. So if I've got, and you need to do this for every individual zone, or you might, spread it across 2 zones if there's a lot of overlap there. And run, you're not going to run them at the same time. You're going to stagger the run, because if you run them at the same time, your pressure is not the same as when you're normally operating them. But if I've got 20 cans in zone number 1, for example, and I set them out there for an hour, and I push start on the irrigation system and I run them for an hour, these might be some of the values I get, right? 1.1 inches, and this is just depth. You can measure that with a ruler and a tuning can, or a coffee can, you need to have a straight sided cylinder. You can't take a pie pan out there because then you're catching more water than the depth. So just be sure you're using a cylinder, coffee can, or tuna can. Or you can buy dedicated measuring devices for that. So 1.1 inches per hour would be the high there, and then a 1/2 inch per hour would be the low, right? And this is probably the area wherever that can was of my irrigation system. This is where that brown spot is. This is where it's drying out. So 20 cans, I'm going to line them up like this from the highest amount to the lowest amount. And then I'm looking for the 25%, right? So if I use 25 cans, I need to find the 5 lowest numbered cans here, right? So that's what we've done here. The overall average of all 20 cans, you add these up and divide by 20, I get 0.812, okay? So that number, that 0.812, that's my precip rate, okay? So that's the precipitation rate of your irrigation system. I'm putting down 0.8 of an inch in an hour with this irrigation system, right? Just the overall average of all my cans. The overall, the average of the 25 lowest cans here was 0.604. So to determine my uniformity, I'm taking the 25% lowest quartile average, dividing by my overall precipitation rate, 0.812, multiply it by 100 to get it in the percentage form. And in this case, with these values here, I've got 74% efficient, 74% uniformity of an irrigation system. Pretty dang good for a home lawn, actually, would be for all the different impervious surfaces, landscape beds, buildings in the way and all that. It's not that bad, right? And you're still looking at a 1/2 inch in some areas and 1.1 inches in some areas, okay? But that's pretty simple, right? That's how you do that. Now you're going to take these values, you're going to go to your controller and going to have a targeted irrigation depth in your mind. This might come from everything we talked about before, right? It might come from an ET value. It might come from your soil type and knowing that a 1/2 inch of moisture is going to penetrate to your 6 or 8 inch depth of your root zone, which is your goal, okay? So I'm taking that targeted irrigation depth in inches and I'm dividing that by my zone precipitation rate to figure out how long I need to run that particular zone for. That's simple, right? So if I want to irrigate with a 1/2 inch that night, I'm using a 1/2 inch. I'm putting 0.5 divided by my precip rate. This is inches per hour. And I'm multiplying that by 60 to give me from an hour to minutes, basically. And I think this should make sense to most people, right? So if I'm looking for a 1/2 inch and my precip rate is 0.8 per hour, I need to put down 37 minutes of irrigation to apply that 1/2 inch, right? And that's easy to get our heads around, because if I run it for 30 minutes, which is half an hour, I'm putting down 4/10, okay? So 37 minutes gets me to a 1/2 inch. Simple stuff. I mean, that's how we're doing it, but you really have to have this precipitation rate number to effectively try to schedule your controller on it from a time standpoint, right? You can look up in some of the manufacturer's books based on spacing to determine, what that might be. At the very, very least, do that and determine what the precip rate is based on the design and the type of sprinklers you're using as a general starting point. Poor man's irrigation system. If you're looking to grow in a lawn for a homeowner or client that doesn't have an irrigation system and you want to water every day, 3 times a day, 5 times a day for just 1 week to germinate some grass seed or to establish a new lawn, I've used these type of systems on home lawn as large as 20,000 square feet, which is, just less than half an acre, right? So you would probably choose one, like this with 4 different valves on it that allow 4 different set sprinklers to come out. But these are pretty cheap, right? 30, 40, 50 bucks. The more money you spend on one, the better unit you're certainly going to get, like anything. This one, I actually took a picture of this guy here. It was right across from Brian Horgan's house, and there was a realtor sign in the property, and there were sprinklers on across the entire house, right? So the realtor was trying to improve the lawn to sell the home with a homeowner that didn't have an irrigation system, and that's a pretty dang good way to do that. So something there. Last thing I'm going to say on irrigation systems, and then we've got I don't know, we'll probably spend 10 minutes just on water conservation, and we'll open it up to any final questions that anybody has. But I know Doug's done some work on drip irrigation systems, I think at the OJ Nora, the Turfgrass Research Center in Madison, and seen some pretty neat results from that. I had a big grant with the Department of Transportation here in Minnesota, where we looked at connecting drip irrigation systems to fire hydrants on roadsides and installing the drip systems either on top of newly laid sod or installing them on top of the soil and laying sod directly on top of that. What I'll tell you is you can connect these systems up, put a simple battery operated timer there. You can also even have a little battery powered rain sensor there. Not battery powered rain sensor, I guess. You're wiring that into your timer. That would be battery powered. But anyway, this is so much more efficient and so much more cost effective and less time consuming than these 2,000 gallon water trucks or whatever that just glug a bunch of water on compacted turf on a roadside and none of it ever gets into the soil. So there's an option there. We see these used a lot in golf. I don't know. There might be a future in this for home lawns and for sports turf. We don't see a lot of it just yet. We see it more. I've seen some research like out of New Mexico State, for example, where they're using it for golf tees. The thing with home lawns is if you're going to aerate that lawn, you've got to put it below that irrigation line. And that's fine because we would probably make that recommendation anyway, right? You don't want it at 4 inches. You probably rather want it at 8 inches. Use capillary action to your advantage there. Common irrigation installation mistakes. We've talked about a little of this. So increasing sprinkler spacing to decrease costs, non-uniform spacing, not triangular or square, undersized or inferior components, mixing full and part circles. This is a big no-no. So if I've got a zone with 6 sprinklers on it, and 2 of the sprinklers are full circle and 4 of the sprinklers are part circle, those part circle heads are traveling, maybe a third of the distance or half the distance there, but I don't have the opportunity to manipulate the runtime. So they're putting 3 times the amount of water down on that half or that 1/3 space area, right? Then those full circle sprinklers have to cover. And then improper programming, that's one of the big things. Just try it, folks. Just turn it off or encourage the homeowner to turn it off. I think you're really going to surprise yourself. And then improper adjustments. All right. Now, just real briefly, water conservation. I wanted to wrap up with this because this is kind of the topic that I'm really passionate about. I have some really strong opinions on these odd even watering bans, and here are just some examples from kind of my area of the restrictions that we see. So we see a lot of odd even watering bans. They might be anywhere from May 1st to September 1st. In my area here, the city of Waconia, the city of Farmington have those bans year round. And that's just fine. Okay, some communities will have no ban generally, but if we get into times of drought, they might have their first ban be odd even watering. The second tier of more drought might be daytime watering restrictions. And then if we get into a really severe drought, like we actually got into that situation in like the fall of 2012, it was I don't know if it was like the hottest summer on record, and then we went from August, September, and October with not a drop of rain. So I was begging. I was singing a different tune then. I was begging people to turn the irrigation systems on, otherwise they would have some long-term consequences. We might see daytime restrictions from 9 a.m. to 8 p.m. as well, right? And here's my statistic there we talked about with Woodbury. All right. The reason I'm not a fan of these is because I acknowledge that cities use them to manage water flow. So they don't want every homeowner demanding water on one particular day, for example. That's the reason for odd even. So if the last number on my property is even, I can water on that even day. If I'm across the road and the last number on my property is odd, I can water the next day. So yeah, as far as from the water engineer standpoint, it's great at reducing that issue of the demand all at once. The problem with it is if I'm an even numbered house, the homeowner is concerned that if they get to an even numbered day and the lawn is dry, they don't have the ability to operate it. So by default, they're always setting it up on every odd day. And we've been talking about it all night long. literally in Minnesota, the most you'd have to water a lawn is once a week. The most, even if we get into a drought setting, once a week with the right soil and the right irrigation practices. So these guys are crazy if they think odd even watering bands are helping with water conservation. It does quite the opposite, because most people I find are setting them to those bands. It's an example of what the restrictions might look like on one of your city's webpage here and the penalties that are associated with it. Here, these are some of the audits that I've done, right? So when and actually, no, this is a 1,000-person survey that I did across the Twin Cities. So here you go, here are your numbers. 43% of this 1,000-person survey had irrigation systems set up to every odd day or every even day. Only 24% were watering the way Doug or I would recommend. Some were on the once per week program. That's just fine. Some acknowledge they adjust them based on season, and that's great as well. But over 45% are every day or every other day. And that makes us turf folks look bad. It wastes money on our precious water resource, and your lawn probably hates you for it. So, sorry to be blunt there, folks, but, that's just it. And then, as far as irrigation audits, there's kind of good news and bad news to all these graphs, right? So these are the number of leaking sprinklers on the x-axis here. So for the number of audits we did 60 of them. 19 of these audits had 0 leaking sprinklers. That's fantastic. That's great. 2 of them had 15 leaking sprinklers. That's terrible, right? So, they would save a lot of money in the long run on just sheer water costs if they would fix those sprinklers. So at least 75% of the people I found had at least 1 leaking sprinkler. 10 core water conservation strategies. I'm not going to go through each one of these. I wanted to be sure you had them in your file for your references. You might see a quiz question on these as well. But this came from Dr. Carl and Dr. Duncan, one of their water use textbooks. And then grass species, this is just kind of reiterating my point here about how much more efficient the warm season grasses at the top of the list here are compared to our cool season grasses at the bottom of the list as far as evapotranspiration rates go. This is just millimeters per day. The numbers don't matter a whole lot to you, but approaching this 10 millimeters per day or greater, you're getting up into 0.4 of an inch or so that our cool season turfs really might need to be replenished on a daily basis. This is millimeters per day. So again, rainfall is helping you out with most of this, and you maybe tolerate a little bit of browning in the summers. Drought resistance, really important topic to at least brush over here. So we usually talk about drought resistance is kind of the overarching category. We determine drought resistance of turf grasses based on the avoidance mechanisms or the tolerance mechanisms, and these are actually distinctly different, right? So drought avoidance would be mechanisms that grass plants have to avoid being injured by drought over lengths of time, right? So we talk about tall fescue with these deep root systems. If you look at the sheer evapotranspiration rates, tall fescue versus Kentucky bluegrass, they use almost the same amount of water on a daily basis. But tall fescue is always touted as a drought avoider, so it has a deeper reservoir in that soil with the root system, so you don't have to irrigate it as frequently, right? Even though it uses the same amount of moisture on a daily basis as bluegrass does. Bluegrass has just fantastic dormancy mechanisms, probably one of our better grasses that goes dormant. You can withhold irrigation from bluegrass for a month, for 5 or 6 weeks in a Minnesota summer. If you get a little bit of rainfall there in the meantime, and still get good recovery with that. Main thing is you don't want your crowns to completely dehydrate. That's when you get some lost. Annual bluegrass escapes drought due to producing seed heads in the spring of the year. That's its avoidance mechanism. And then we have drought tolerance. So I would just call some of these grasses the low water users, right? So fine fescue probably has a shorter root system than tall fescue and bluegrass, but it just uses a lot lower water. When we look at it on this ET thing, it's going to be up kind of in this here category, right? Hard fescue, chewings fescue, the creeping red fescues, for example. Zoysia grass as a warm season turf is a really good low water user as well. Right. So here's, kind of just a way you might categorize those. Again, resistance is the combination of avoidance and tolerance. So if we have excellent avoidance with tall fescue, deep root system, fair tolerance, we get very good resistance. With fine fescues, they're not great at avoiding drought, but they have excellent tolerance because they're low water users. They're very good as well. And there you have it. I think we consider the fine fescues to be pretty dang good at surviving a drought. But don't misunderstand me. Kentucky bluegrass would rank good also. Annual bluegrass is terrible, and perennial ryegrass we would consider fair. Deficit irrigation, we've talked about this a little bit. This is kind of just these crop coefficients, right? Whatever multiplier you're using, basically we found that turf can survive at lower water levels than your ET models will give you. Okay, so we don't always have to replace 100% of ET, even if you do have a crop coefficient. Mowing height has an influence here. You've all probably known this or probably heard about it. But I like to think of the top growth of our turf kind of as a reflection of what the root system looks like. The lower we mow, the more stress we're putting on our turf plants. It kind of works that way, right? If your soil sucks, it's compacted and terrible, and you mow real high, you're not going to reap those benefits. But just again, think of your soil, your root system as that reservoir to withdraw water. I'm going to have to irrigate this much more frequently. Then I'm going to have to irrigate this. This is going to fail. This bluegrass on the left side here, cut at 1/4 of an inch, is going to fail in a drought situation much sooner than the bluegrass on the right-hand side. So just extreme example. All right. Finally here, just other management practices, back to kind of that everything comes into play here. Judicious use of fertilizer, more nitrogen we put down, the more growth we have and the greater ET rates we have. So we need to balance fertility with irrigation to reduce water. Potassium, I'm not saying go put down a bunch of potassium, but just to mention that physiologically, the potassium ion within those guard cells influences the opening and closing of the stomata that we talked about. Growth regulators would come into play, probably not for home lawn settings, but definitely for sports field settings. So, these are just, a couple of the root uptake, Trinexpec Primo, that's a foliar uptake. And then we've got Florprimidol, which is Cutlass. That is a root uptake growth regulator, and Malfluidide no longer on the marketplace, but that was Embark. And then Pigment sunscreen for turf. A lot of debate out there. Don't put them on home lawns, but there might be some value depending on your location. Okay, just to summarize everything, I did pretty good. This is good for me, folks, to end 6 minutes early. So I guess it's a good thing the questions were light tonight, as well. But I'm always kind of an overachiever as far as the amount of content I think we can get through. But hopefully this helped you wrap your heads around my thoughts on water use in the turf industry. It's certainly one of the biggest challenges. Try to be sure you're not one of the problem. Part of the problem. Strategies to reduce water use must consider the turf system as a whole, this holistic approach, not just our finger on that start button, of the irrigation system. Soil type has a huge influence on plant available water. And at least for our urban areas, our suburbs, where we're going with the lowest bidding contractor and really poor quality soils that get rolled out with Kentucky bluegrass sod, we're really not doing ourselves any favor, right? So soil is probably the number one factor here, influencing the amount that we have to water our lawns to maintain any. And then use technology to your advantage. Be thorough with irrigation system auditing, and consider some of these drought tolerant species and cultural practices to reduce water use long term.